Welcome to What Lies Beyond with your host, Matt Coburn. Conversations on consciousness science, the paranormal, and the post-material future. Visit us and subscribe on whatliesbeyond.substack.com. This is the final episode of Season 1. Today's guest is Dr. Jennifer Gidley. Jennifer is an author, climate educator, psychologist, and international futurist. She's a global thought leader and advocate for human-centered futures in an era of high-tech hype. Jennifer is an adjunct professor, Institute for Sustainable Futures, Sydney, and has held academic posts in 4 Australian universities. She's a fellow at the Botin Centre, Santander, Spain, and a non-resident fellow of Trends Research and Advisory in Abu Dhabi. She's held a visiting professorship at Olomouc University, Czech Republic, and a visiting research fellowship at Sciences Po, Paris, France. She was also the longest-serving elected president of the World Futures Studies Federation from 2009 to 2017. Jennifer's most recent project is the founding of Global Futures Education as a platform to provide high-level online education for professionals and executives. Over several years, she has created a series of executive-level online courses on grand global futures challenges and solutions. She's also the author of 2016's The Future, A Very Short Introduction from Oxford University Press. In this interview, recorded September 2024, we discuss the difference between what Jennifer calls a technocentric future and a human-centered one. Advocates of technocentric futures tend to assume that technology can solve everything. These sorts of futures are also based in a strongly materialist worldview. By contrast, Jennifer advocates human-centered futures, which see human beings as kind, fair, consciously evolving agents with a responsibility to maintain ecological balance between humans, world, and cosmos. If you're feeling disempowered about the future, then I hope you'll find our dialogue as inspiring as I did. And I'd like to thank my regular audience for listening this season. What Lies Beyond will be back in February 2025 for Season 2. Jennifer Gidley, many thanks for coming on the show.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Matt, and I'll be excited to speak with you about these ideas.
And we've got some very interesting things to talk about today. But we'll start with a simple question, which is, what is futures studies?
So I came up with a definition of future studies when I was writing my book, The Future, A Very Short Introduction. So basically I see future studies as the art and science of taking responsibility for the consequences of our behaviours and our decisions and our actions today. There are many people that talk about future studies and they have different ideas about it. And it's a very broad church today. It's become an academic field. And we have, a huge cross-section of people, from academics to activists, from consultants to trend spotters and students and so on. And I think, there's an awful lot of people today talking about the future and looking at the future. And one of the things, sadly for me, that I discovered when I was working as president of the World Future Studies Federation is that so many people talking about the future actually have no idea that there's been a scholarly field, if you like, that's been going on for 50 odd years.
Yes, it's certainly a field that's long interested me. I mean, the primary focus on this podcast is consciousness, but actually I've been very interested in future studies too. And it was one of the things I was hoping to do in my project. It's a little bit of a combination of those two disciplines. So there's the World Future Society. They used to do a magazine called The Futurist. I think I contributed a couple of articles to that way back in the mists of time.
And there's a lot of academic journals now as well. There's several journals on futures and futures thinking and foresight and so on.
So it's a vibrant field. A lot of the things we're talking about are from your book, The Future, a very short introduction. But actually, in that you discuss futures in plural, why we should be talking about futures rather than the future. So why did you think that was important?
Well, I'll just mention a funny little anecdote that when I was approached by Oxford to produce that book, I wanted to call it Future Studies, and they wanted to call it The Future. And I had to have a sort of a debate with them about the fact that there is no one future and it's not predictable and so on. But eventually they won the argument. But it gave me an opportunity to talk about in one of the chapters why I prefer to use the plural term futures and not just the future. So basically the idea of one future comes out of scientific positivism. It comes out of the Newtonian worldview, the Newtonian building block universe, which believes that everything is mechanical and therefore it's predictable. So that's a worldview that goes back to around the 18th century. And Newton, even though he was the first modern scientist, was a complex personality who was also the last of the old alchemists and astrologers. And, he was actually a very complex person. And he certainly wasn't, he'd probably turn over in his grave if he saw what people meant when they said Newtonian physics today. But nevertheless, what was picked up from him was the modern empirical positivist approach. There's other people that were associated that built on that work, such as Lemaitre, who wrote the book Man as Machine or L'Homme Machine. And his work was very mechanistic. He was a materialist. He thought that human nature could be understood in the same way as machines. And he's been very influential in a certain stream of human psychology and human consciousness and human understanding, which in a sense I see as leading today to what I call the technotopian futures, which we might talk about a bit later. So Lemaitre's mechanistic view of human nature formed the foundations of Skinner's behaviorism, the kind of cybernetic view of human intelligence and human consciousness, and the contemporary branches of transhumanism.
It's also influential to this day in mainstream consciousness studies. One of the leading people pushing a materialist approach to consciousness is Anil Seth. And in his book, he calls humans beast machines. And it's a direct reference to Lemaitre's work.
Yeah. Very interesting. So, by the time I got involved in future studies, which was in the 90s, the field was very much established as a futures studies field, plural. But that arose from people in the 60s and 70s. There was a whole shift of thinking, as you all know, that sort of a big paradigm shift where pluralism started to become recognised as a way of thinking, particularly in the social sciences and humanities. So positivism as the only way of thinking or the only epistemology was suddenly called into question by Thomas Kuhn and various other scientific and philosophical thinkers who said, look, this is not the only way that we can think about reality. It's fine with physics, but when it comes to biology, we had theories like emergentism coming through, self-organizing principles, and of course in studying humans, we have psychology and anthropology and so on, and they're not predictable, and they're very messy, and they're not based on building blocks, although some people might still like to think that they are.
Yeah.
So during that time, in the sort of origins of the future studies movement, we had in the late 60s, there was a group of they were peace researchers, anthropologists, journalists, activists, and people that were very they were very aware of how future thinking had been evolving, particularly in the US, which was it was primarily used by the RAND organization and various Defense Department groups and so on, developing scenarios to do with war. This is the first half of the 20th century, when we had the First World War, the Second World War, and the whole idea of scenarios and planning. It grew out of planning. And US and Russia and Germany and so on were all doing their nation-state planning. And in a sense, the movement in the US of, say, the World Future Society and future singular studies grew out of this movement. These other people were a much broader group, and they were very much abreast of the pluralist thinking and the various movements that were happening at the time. And a group of them formed a group, and they created a conference, and they wrote a book. I don't know if you've heard of this, but Mankind 2000.
No.
Okay, so in the late 60s, the kind of leaders of that were Johann Geltung, who also founded the peace movement, Robert Jung, who was a German a futurist and created various organizations in Germany on future studies. So they had a big conference in the late, they had a few conferences through the late 60s and into the early 70s. And interestingly, out of that series of meetings grew the World Future Studies Federation, which was the group I've been involved in and was president of, and is very much about pluralistic approaches to futures thinking and alternative approaches to prediction and so on. But the other group that formed out of that was the Club of Rome.
Oh.
I thought you'd find that interesting, because
yes,
in your report, which is a very interesting report. So there was kind of two groups that grew out of that Mankind 2000.
But the Club of Rome, we should mention, originated a very crucial book in, I think, 1972 called Limits to Growth.
That's right.
They ran computer simulations, didn't they? And basically predicted that if we didn't start using our resources better, we faced sort of collapse around now, actually.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. And the people that created the Club of Rome, and also the people that founded the World Future Studies Federation, were sort of very much involved in that kind of thinking, and not just ecological thinking and the importance of limits to growth, but the democratization of futures thinking. So the idea that these important methodologies and concepts and tools shouldn't be just held in the hands of the elite of the military-industrial societies, but they should be accessible to all people across all cultures. So it was very much, a diverse, culturally diverse and politically diverse group of people. And in a sense, it was through the people that formed the World Future Studies Federation that these different approaches to future studies arose, which I talk about in my book.
Okay.
So, in addition to prediction, which is all about extrapolating from the past, basically, That's what
Yeah.
prediction is. It's looking at the trends of the past and extrapolating and say, well, this is going to be a linear curve. And if this has been happening, this is what's going to happen. But of course, we know in our field of consciousness and through various other, thinking concepts, integral thinking and so on, that it's not linear. The world doesn't operate in linear ways, and even evolution doesn't operate in a linear way. So, so there began to occur, new ideas about how we can approach the future. So, people that were into critical theory started to say, well, whose future are we talking about?
Yes.
Questioning the status quo and looking at the power discourse in relation to futures. So the critical theorists, the critical futures area. And then you also had the people that got into the sort of cultural side that was specifically focused on, I think you've mentioned the idea of the post-colonial concept. And so
Yes.
the idea of diverse cultures and diverse civilizations. So different people had different ideas about how they would want the future to be. And it's not necessarily going to be an Anglo-European, Western kind of approach. So that's what I call cultural futures. And then the third one is participatory futures, which gets people very involved in workshops and participation in envisioning the future that they want and, designing it, and then ultimately, having the agency to create the future that they want. And then finally, there's integral futures, which has been a slightly contested concept. Some people that got involved in integral futures were connected with Ken Wilber's work. Others have been connected with other sort of holistic or integral theories. So there's actually two special issues on integral futures, just as a subfield in itself. So it is, as you say, a very rich and vibrant field.
Yes. So, and I think it's very important that it's, I like that this approach is pluralistic as well, because very often, particularly in the media, what we have when the future's discussed, it's either things like climate breakdown or whatever, but on it's mostly in terms of technological innovation. So it's, oh well, such and such a company, usually from Silicon Valley, has just invented this amazing new thing that we're all going to have. And I think what's concerned me about that kind of approach for some time is it's very passive. It gives most people a very passive role. You just need to accept that all of this is inevitable. It's going to happen. So I like that idea of agency. Do you think that's a particularly crucial thing?
Personally, I think that human agency is absolutely crucial in creating alternative futures to the sort of the dominant trajectory. In spite of what I've said about trend, you can't predict the future because the trends aren't linear. At the same time, we have to be aware that there are certain big global challenges happening in the world, such as climate crisis, which is going on a certain trajectory at the moment. And if that continues on that trajectory, where, we're facing massive catastrophes on a scale. So, and technology is not going to fix it. This is the thing. I mean, there's a lot of people these days, because I work in the climate field quite a bit at the moment related to courses that I'm offering and so on. But there's a lot of people at the moment getting into what they call climate tech.
Okay.
And it's kind of a fashion, I think, because climate's a big issue that, a lot of people are now accepting and admitting is a big issue. And a lot of people that are in the tech field, I think, are seeing it as an opportunity that we can get in on a sort of climate bandwagon, if you like, and create all kinds of climate tech. And I'm sure, I'm not being critical, I'm sure there are some wonderful things being created and developed that are, cleaning up plastic in the ocean, for instance. There's technology required for that, in the rivers. That, there's an enormous amount of technology that is required to fix a lot of the problems that we've created. But at the same time, I see there's quite a lot of sort of hype and hubris around just the extent of what can be done, particularly coming out of Silicon Valley, and unfortunately coming out of the oil companies, the fossil fuel companies, who have
Okay.
come up with wonderful concepts of they call it carbon capture and storage, CCS. So they've
Okay.
invented their very expensive, multi-billion-dollar pieces of machinery that are supposedly capturing the carbon as it comes out of the refineries and out of, industrial centres and so on. But actually, it's just minuscule what they're capturing. And
Yes.
when it comes down to it, they're not doing anything like the job that's done by forests
Yes.
or even the giant kelp in the ocean or many of these nature-based solutions. So I think the whole thing about technology today, and this is where I start to go into this technotopian future idea,
Yes.
is that technology has become, well, it's become a force in the world, high tech. It's Silicon Valley is a huge proponent of this, and we know, I think many of us know, perhaps some people don't, that within the top 10 biggest companies in the world, most of them are tech companies,
Yes.
and the top 5 richest men in the world, and they are men, are pretty
Yes.
much tech, the big tech gurus. So it's more than just technology. It's now a geopolitical issue
Yes.
because
It is huge.
it's huge. And it dominates every aspect of our lives. I mean, I
It-
grew up pre-television. When I was born, there was no television. And so for people of my generation, even though I'm pretty tech savvy for my generation, and run online courses and so on, I still find it very challenging. And I'm sure that a lot of people my age and older must find it extremely challenging, that there's a lot of things you can't do today unless you've got an app for it.
Yes, that's true.
You can't on your smartphone. You can't book a doctor. They won't answer the phone. They say, I'll go to HotDoc and book the doctor online.
Yes.
Through Hot. And you've got to have passwords, and you've got to have, if you've got an app for it, well, it's even quicker.
Just
Dominate everything.
Oh, it does. And just yesterday, actually, I saw this advert or this article on they're using holographic doctors for cancer care. So what you have is a booth where it projects a doctor, and it's like I think the biggest issue that I have a number of issues actually with Silicon Valley, and it's one of the things I discuss in my book. But I think Douglas Rushkoff, who's a sort of tech commentator amongst other things, he really put his fingers on it because he talked about the mindset, and this is based in staunch materialism. So you were talking about the Newtonian mindset earlier, but that's slightly updated, in sort of tech informational terms, is the worldview of a lot of the Silicon Valley guys who are
Exactly.
pushing this.
Exactly. It's the techno-fix solution. Within the futures field, just to sidestep a little bit, within the future studies field, there's people talk about Malthusians and cornucopians. So the Malthusians are the pessimists, and that comes from the idea of Thomas Malthus, who wrote a book about population growth, that the population was going to explode and we wouldn't have enough resources and so on. This was back in I can't remember the exact date, but I think late 18th century. And he was sort of contradicted by what we call the cornucopians, based on the idea of the horn of plenty, cornucopia. And they came up with the notion that, it's not a problem because whatever problems we create, technology can fix it, because technology was beginning to grow quite rapidly, even, couple of hundred years ago. So we've had these interesting swings between the kind of techno utopian future idea of the technology will save everything and fix everything, and then there'll be some sort of a collapse, and then you'll have the Malthusians that are. Thomas Ehrlich was a recent the population bomb. Ehrlich's book, the population bomb, that was kind of a recent expression of the Malthusian idea that the population of the Earth is expanding too much, and there's a lot of people that talk about that today, and we don't have the resources. Well, of course, the reason we don't have the resources is because 1% of the population has more than 50% of the resources.
Yes.
If everybody lived like a person in Uganda or Kenya or even Haiti or somewhere, and that would be challenging for people like us that are sort of middle class Australians and Americans and so on. But if we all lived like that, there'd be enough resources for everyone.
Yeah.
It's just there's not enough resources for everyone to live like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos,
No.
So it's the distribution of resources that's the issue.
The sort of worldview of, say, particularly Elon Musk, who's very outspoken about it. He's talked about, he's supportive of a philosophy called long-termism, which is technotopian capitalism to the max. So in the future, the world will be completely subjugated. A lot of the animals will be wiped out. And then there'll be billions or even trillions of virtual humans in space. And this is seen as a desirable future. And I
to be honest, I find it terribly unconvincing. Douglas Rushkoff calls them the tech bros. And I don't want to be too insulting, but most of them are pretty uneducated. They haven't had a liberal arts degree. Yep. They haven't had a liberal arts degree where they've studied, history, philosophy, psychology, human geography, history of ideas, any of these things. Many of them have sort of come out of school and gone into, they've created an app in their garage. And then they've managed to find a venture capitalist to give them a couple of billion for it, and off they go. I'm being a hyperbolic here, but they're a pretty narrow, culturally narrow group of people. They're mostly young white males, and we know that in America these days, a lot of young white males have really swung to the right, the far right.
Yes.
So there's a whole kind of a shift towards, as long as we're okay and as long as we're making money out of our technology, it really doesn't matter all that much what happens to other people or to the planet, because we can just go and colonize Mars or colonize satellite cities. And we can just simply shoot, what do they call them? There's who's the guy? David Pearce, I think it is, who's a transhumanist. They talk about, shooting nanoterrites into space, and they will just form Earth, just naturally form Earth somehow.
What, really?
Yeah, on these satellites. They make these satellite.
Well, that's from Star Trek.
So, they just don't really think things through. That's to put it very kindly.
No,
even an organisation like MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology Research Institute, is quoted on their website saying much of the stuff that's talked about in relation to AI, artificial superintelligence, all of this simply science fiction still.
Yes. Oh,
and
totally. Yes.
As for satellite cities and nanoterabytes and living on Mars, you can't go to Mars without all your bones dissolving, and then you die. That's just physiologically impossible. So they really don't understand the big picture of life.
I actually do. It's one of my sidelines. I do space art, and when I was younger, I was very much sold on the whole, we'll go into space story. But to be honest, over the last 20 years or so, I've gradually shifted my view, and I think a lot of people who are in the know have also shifted their view that things like settling Mars is a lot tougher than in the science fiction books. And the other thing is, there's a wonderful book, I think it's called Astrotopia, which takes a critical look at the worldview of the tech bros who are going into space. And one of it was talking about the intrinsic rights of planets, which is an extension of the idea that ecosystems, trees, forests have intrinsic worth and right. And it extends it to the moon and Mars. And one of the things that's very noticeable with, say, Elon Musk is I find the images coming back from the space probes, beautiful and fascinating. And I've got a telescope. I love the moon as a pristine environment. And it's wonderful having those high definition pictures of the lunar surface. And the more you get to know our natural environment in the solar system, the less you want it to be trashed by hyper capitalists.
Well, it's just another form of colonialism, isn't it?
Yes, 100%.
We've run out of unknown islands to colonize. We have to move beyond Earth to find something else.
And it's already damaging. I mean, the amount of space junk in orbit, and there are lots of the Starlink satellites have made it much worse. Yeah. It's a dire situation.
Yep.
So we've talked a little bit about technotopian futures. So these are very tech-heavy futures, but you're an advocate of human-centered futures. So could you tell me a little bit about what that is and what that involves, and maybe how those values differ from the tech bros we were talking about?
Yeah. Well, I'll draw a distinction between, what I call technotopian and human-centered futures. The technotopian futures, which you find in among the transhumanists today, they use the term enhancement, human enhancement, and what they mean by that is something's got to be altered using technology or sort of biological or genetic manipulation, if you like. So they're sort of moving beyond what the natural human is, if you like, and well beyond what we use in medical sciences and so on, which is a positive and healthy thing. It's about sort of going beyond the normal where we are now, and I want to be able to, at my age, run in a marathon or something, and so therefore, win a marathon. So therefore, I need to get these robotic enhanced arms and legs so I can do that. So it's all sort of an add-on. It's an add-on to what the human being is, and I call it an enhancement. Then, whereas human-centered futures is about human advancement. So it's humans advancing, by choice, by effort, by cultural experiences, education, self-discipline to advance themselves. And this is where we start to move into evolution of consciousness, and in particular, just conscious evolution. So, and I talk in my book a bit about the two types of transhumanism and how the concept of transhumanism originated a long time before these tech bros started using it. And it was then, by people like Pierre Teilhard de Chardin and Julian Huxley, who were actually talking about a sort of a spiritual, cultural evolution of human nature, as many others over the last 100 years or so have talked about, Rudolf Steiner, Sri Aurobindo, Jean Gebs later on, Wilbur, and many others. But it requires, it requires an active activity of the human being, an active part of oneself, or for people working culturally or educationally to sort of draw people up, to advance people, to advance civilization. This is the human side. This is the human-centered side of it. It's not just about trying to take shortcuts and saying, well, if I just, as Elon Musk's neural lace and so on, neural link, to bring about brain-computer interface.
Yes.
I mean, in medicine, they're using some degree of brain-computer interface now to help certain people, with Parkinson's, or they can sort of do things to get the nerves working in a certain way if they've got a paralyzed arm or whatever. But what the technotopians are talking about, like Elon Musk with his neural link, he says, well, we don't even have to upload anything. We can just shoot one of these things into our jugular. And then all of a sudden we've got this kind of, it's like putting, somehow shooting Wi-Fi into your jugular, so your brain is automatically all connected to Wi-Fi to do it through your computer. I mean, I find it horrifying, but that's maybe I should.
Well, I think I'm old-fashioned too, because it worries me a great deal that it's an extension of what's been called surveillance capitalism. So our every move is already being monitored by our smartphone devices, etc. This, to me, is the colonization of the mind, because you're going, oh, well, we're not just content with that. We want to actually get inside your head. Look, it's marketed as something fun and I'm sure you'll get people signing it up. I saw just yesterday an EEG headset that's being commercially marketed, which can tell you when you're feeling tired.
Right. Okay. Fair enough.
From your brain waves.
Yeah. Understand. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, yes, it's way beyond just stealing your data, isn't it? That's on your computer. That's bad enough.
Yeah.
That's capitalism as it is. But to actually, the idea of getting into people's brains and directly, that's a little bit beyond the pale.
I think it's a violation. I'm sorry.
Absolutely. Of course it is. Of course it is. Yeah. Yeah. You've got, so in that whole technotopian area, you've got, you've got AI, and the idea of the purpose of AI and ASI, artificial super intelligence, so-called, is to try and compete with humans. And then, for this merge, that when you start to get into what Ray Kurzweil calls the singularity. So there's got this view, as I'm sure you know, of the idea that, at some point in the near future, there's going to be a merging of human intelligence and computer intelligence, whether it's uploaded, whether it's by people uploading their brains to computers, or computers being things being injected into your brain, or whatever. But it's all about control, and it's it's about making money. So it's a greed-based view. It's a greed-based approach.
Yes.
I would say it's not about. Okay, so you could say that technotopian futurists and human-centered futurist people are all on about trying to improve the human condition, or grow what humans are capable of, or whatever. But the technology-based approach is not altruistic. I don't think it's about making money.
I'm very relieved to hear you saying these things.
Single new app, every single new platform, every single new iPhone, whatever it is, it's about making money for a very small handful of people that want more and more control of the world. And they already have a huge amount of control.
Yes, absolutely.
Starlink and all that sort of stuff. So, by contrast, and move out of that territory now, and by contrast, if we look at human-centered futures and look at how humans can evolve, how we have evolved, and how we can evolve further, I mean, the evolution of consciousness, the notion of evolution of consciousness has been around for at least,
Mm.
a couple of hundred years. I mean, we had Henry Bergson, we had Nietzsche talking about the idea of the Übermensch or the Superman.
Okay.
That wasn't a technology thing. That was about the human being growing beyond what we currently are.
Okay.
Towards the more spiritual, towards angels, if you like, or spiritual beings. Bergson had an interesting thing that he said, which was something like, I'm just paraphrasing, but in the same way that humans, that in the same way that sort of plants grew out of minerals and animals grew out of plants and left behind the plants, humans grew out of animals, but there's something else that can grow out of humans that is a future stage, and he calls that superhuman, or Nietzsche used the word Übermensch, Steiner uses spirit self, and so on. Now, there are so many cultural and spiritual disciplines and methods that have been going on for not just a couple of hundred years, but, much longer than that, really, but more in secret brotherhoods rather than in public, how to develop human beings, how do human beings develop themselves. So I've brought it down to three fields of knowledge. So you've got cultural evolution, cultural history or cultural evolution, which definitely shows a trajectory of people moving from, earlier stages or states of being, from sort of hunter-gatherer to, agricultural people that then started to develop myths and stories. And then we had moving from that into the beginnings of alphabets and mathematics and things in the sort of Greco-Roman period. And then, into this is a Gebserian idea. So then you're moving about the Renaissance period, according to Gebser, and according to a lot of other sort of evolution of consciousness theorists.
Yes, that's
sort of first signs of this new awakening, this new, what he calls integral consciousness, began to emerge. And of course, it always takes several hundred years or more for the vast majority of people to catch up. I mean, the Greek philosophers they kind of developed rational thinking, rationality, or what in psychology Piaget called formal operations. But it's sort of taken 2,000 years before formal thinking, modern science, modern philosophy, etc., started to be actual, disciplines that the masses of people could learn about and become wise to. So you've got, on one stream, you've got cultural evolution going on, where the whole body of humanity is kind of being moved along in a great movement. Whether you call it teleology or, whether you call it universe or spirit or God or whatever, or divine intelligence, or it is an observable reality. Now, some people would counter that and say, oh, yes, but it looks like people have become less evolved now because we're doing things like killing each other. And, we've always done that. But
yes, I mean, I'll just say I'm aware of critical arguments against this For example, that it's perhaps a bit West centric, so we're giving ourselves a starring role. Oh, you sorry, Eurocentric. But having said that, I was in the National Gallery in London a couple of weeks ago, and I went to the just pre-Renaissance and then Renaissance painting galleries, and I was thinking about exactly this, the shift in consciousness. And if you look at those paintings, there's a noticeable difference in the space of a generation or two between the late medieval and into the Renaissance. And it's very difficult to reject the idea that there was a significant shift around that time.
Yes, yes, interesting. So that's the cultural trajectory. And then you've got the psychology, the individual psychology. So the culture is the group, the psychology is the individual, the development of the individual. So you've got the discipline of developmental psychology. And Piaget, of course, is one of the great psychologists of the 20th century. And he came up with the idea of these 4 stages, sensory motor, pre-operations, concrete operations, and then formal operations. And formal operations got us to where sort of adolescent, early adulthood.
Okay.
But then the question is, well, what happens after that? And Piaget himself said on some occasions that he did speculate, he did think that there was probably another type of operations or rationality or whatever that was beyond formal operations, but he hadn't had a chance to study it and he hadn't had a chance to sort of develop any theories on it. So what in fact happened was that in the 70s, starting in the 70s in the US particularly, a number of developmental psychologists started to work with, what they called mature, advanced adults, thinking people. They also, not just people of the time, but looking at, through history, looking at some of the great scientists and like Einstein and quantum theorists, and what they were developing was beyond formal operations. So they must have had thinking that went beyond formal operations. So, there's been a lot of empirical work and theoretical work done by those psychologists now around the world on developing what's called post-formal reasoning, on identifying what's called post-formal reasoning. And I've written about this quite a lot in my book, Post-Formal Education, where I'm the idea of if we are in fact evolving as human beings, and we are developing, we have the potential to develop these new levels, stages of thinking and culture, how should we be educating children for that?
Yes, good question. So education doesn't just end at 16 or 18 or 21.
Exactly. So there are those two. So there's cultural and then there's psychological. And then you've got the wonderful Michael Murphy, who was one of the founders of the Salon Institute, who wrote his miraculous book, The Future of the Body. Is great.
Yes. It's on my shelf too.
Yeah, it's on mine, and it's a hard one to read. I can't say I've read it all, but I've skipped through it. And so his idea is that, people do have supernormal abilities. Many people in the past and today do have supernormal abilities, and they can develop them. They don't need drugs like Lance Armstrong, and they don't need to be putting things into their, jugular to give them advanced computer thoughts or processing. They can develop these out of their own will.
Because it comes from within, and I think that's what I like about this. It gives you back agency. The issue that one of the many issues I have with the sort of tech bro approach is that it strips you of that agency we were talking about. But I came across Murphy's book quite a few years ago, and I was sort of struggling out of quite a difficult period, and it was so important because he lays out quite a number of lines of potential development. So not just things like meditation and yoga. There's all sorts of things in there, including actually sports. But I keep thinking though that I don't know whether you're familiar with the Dune novels of Frank Herbert and the
I know of them. I haven't actually read them.
right. Well, that depicts a future. It's not a terribly nice future, actually, but the interesting thing is they've had what's called the Butlerian Jihad, where AI has been banned, but instead you have groups of human beings like the Bene Gesserit developing exactly what we're talking about, these sorts of extended human abilities. And the novels are in some ways an extended exploration of exactly that sort of theme.
Right.
So it's like
Yes. Yes.
and the movie's good as well. It's quite close, but
Yeah, yeah. June. That's just June 2's just come out, hasn't it? Recently.
yes, that's right. So, but what they depict is the Bene Gesserit are a bunch of well, they're a somewhat shady group of they're all female, although males can get Bene Gesserit training too, but they have this intense training so that they have this exquisite control over their bodies, so down to the molecule level.
You're right.
And it's very much I think Herbert was very much inspired by the human potential movement that we've been talking about, because it was written in the 60s and at about the time when all this stuff was happening. Yeah, so it's
It
worth
was
a
very
read.
much happening in those, 60s and 70s and so on about all this. I think, in many ways, the exponential development of tech has really created a dumbing down
Yes,
of
I think so.
humanity. And young people are growing up with, they're on their phones from a very young age. They're on their computers and phones in schools. And they're just being, well, do you know Tristan Harris from the Humane Technology Institute?
I have heard of him, yes. Can you explain a bit about his work?
He uses the word human downgrading. He talks about the fact that he's an ex-Google engineer who was in there working in Google trying to develop the ethics side of Google's operations. And he left and he formed this institute with another guy. And they talk a lot about the fact that what's been designed into the technology, this addiction and distraction that's been designed into the technology, has the effect of downgrading human nature. So it's actually destroying our potential. It's not evolving us or enhancing it. So it's actually destroying our potential. And Marshall McLuhan, back in I think he was writing about in the 60s, Canadian philosopher, and he particularly focused on the media. You probably know that the media is the message. That's one of his books. Yeah.
Yes.
So he famously claimed that every technology extension is an amputation.
Okay.
So, for instance, once we have a car, we don't need to walk as much. When we have a GPS in the car, we don't need to remember, where we're going or, be able to read a street directory. So we've got a hard drive on our computer, so we don't need to remember things. Children at school no longer learn to add up or subtract they just do everything on a little calculator. So we're losing faculties all the time. Every time a computer does something for us, we're losing faculties.
Yes.
Tristan saying the same thing now, and I'm saying the same thing now, and probably Douglas Rushkoff and probably you. So there's some of us on about this stuff.
I talk as a disillusioned because actually, like Rushkoff, in the 90s, I was very attracted by the idea. I did an MSc in cognitive science, so I learned a lot about AI, and also I had very utopian ideas about the internet. And I'm afraid to say the last 30 years have not fulfilled the promise even remotely. And I think just because we are drawing slightly to a close, but summing up, my sense has long been, ever since I read your book, that transpersonal experiences, the kinds of self-transformative experiences we're talking about, are a much better fit for the human-centered future than for the technotopian one.
Absolutely. Yes, yes, definitely. Definitely. Yes. Yes. Yeah,
So, so
absolutely.
just finishing, is there anything, what are you working on at the moment? Is there any current project that you think significant that,
Okay. Well, yes. What I'm working on at the moment is a suite of online courses on the Grand Global Futures Challenges and what we can do about them. And this actually came out of the last chapter of my book on the Grand Global Challenges. I don't know if you remember, I created a mind map of the Grand Global Challenges and then
oh, yes.
the alternatives. And that was across environmental, socio-cultural and geopolitical domains. And I had a lot of positive feedback about those, and people said they'd like to know more. And I eventually decided over the last few years to turn them into courses. So, and particularly as climate crisis has become more and more pressing. So the first course is Global Futures of Climate,
Okay.
climate change and turnaround, energy, old and new energy systems, ecosystem collapse and reboot. So each course has 12 lessons, half of them are on the challenges and half of them are on the solutions.
Okay.
And they also, they're not looking just at the external world. I take into account the sort of stuff that we saw in this beautiful report from the Club of Rome, the
Yes.
the importance of the inner development has to be going in parallel with the outer development. So in a sense, we can't change the problems in the outside world without changing our thinking. And when you
Yes.
consider the problems we have at the moment have been created by old thinking, the old thinking that is well past its use-by date. So we really need to transform our thinking and our consciousness. And there's ways to do that across all the disciplines. In economics, you've got the circular economy. In
Yes.
technology, they've got all this exponential stuff, and then you've got the Tristan Harris humane technology, and you've got people doing ethical technology. So in every one of these challenges, there's a solution, and most of what the ones they focus on are nature-based or human-centered.
Brilliant.
So using human agency, yeah.
So I think it's really good that you're doing that course. It sounds like it will help empower people. Okay, well, I think we're drawing to a close, Jennifer. It's been really fascinating. I think we've discussed some very provocative issues about the future. Have you any final thoughts?
Well, I am an optimist, in spite of the fact that I spend a lot of my time, dealing in global challenges and looking at the horrors of climate crisis and exponential technology and global inequity, the growing disparity between rich and poor and so on. I think because I believe in human nature, and I do believe in human agency, I think that we are the solution, basically. We are the solution. So humans have to stand up and take a stand and claim our futures, claim the futures that we want, claim the climate that we want. That doesn't just mean being an activist, but it means, just knowing what you can do, kind of knowing what your abilities and skills and gifts are, and finding a way that you can work on some of these issues, find a solution, share it with other people. Pretty sort of basic human stuff, the kind of stuff that we've done for millennia, really.
Yeah. So essentially it's about empowerment, but empowering yourself, empowering communities to create a future rather than just to sort of passively wait for the future to come along.
Yeah. And don't let the dominant forces that, the powers that be that really are only about themselves, They're sort of, their egos with greed-driven egos, if you like, that are just wanting to have more and more for themselves. They're not
Yes.
thinking about the planet. They're not thinking about the, 8 billion people or.
No.
So yes, empowering education for empowerment, I suppose, educating people about the challenges, the solutions, about how they can change their mindset in all sorts of areas. That's what my writing's all about as well.
Brilliant.
So,
and we'll put links up to your website and courses and books on the show notes. So, Jennifer Gidley, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matt. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. What Lies Beyond with Matt Coburn. Conversations on consciousness science, the paranormal and the post-material future. Visit us and subscribe on whatliesbeyond.substack.com.